Yeah, I guess if you wanted to start with introducing yourself and your research.
Mhm. Sure. My name is Canton. I'm a sociology PhD candidate at the University of California, Irvine. And I study the intersection of gender and sexuality in a bunch of different ways, but I'm specifically interested in the ways that we can study that intersection through asexual experiences and perspectives, and what that can shine light on, even for people who are not asexual.
Hmm. And so obviously asexuality is not the most well-known of orientations. I'm kind of curious about how you got on to researching that in particular, and why that's the focus of your research rather than other
Mm.
broader sexualities that are more well-known.
That's such a good question. So I should say I don't myself identify as asexual. I identify as queer. So I think, we have some overlaps in queer experiences, but of course there are important differences too. Um, I became interested in asexuality because I've known for a long time I was interested in studying the intersection of gender and sexuality. And so I asked myself, like, who do I talk to if I want to learn more about that? And I think often when you want to learn about the way that like power dynamics work, the
Mm.
best way to do that is to talk to people who kind of exist at the margins of those power systems. And so when I was thinking about gender and sexuality, asexuality stood out to me as like, wow, this is a group of people I can talk to who have this expertise that I'm looking for.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I have found that in the ace community, we do talk quite a lot about sex, especially considering the not feeling sexual attraction bit of it. Um, and because we're able to, I guess, see it from a more detached
Mhm.
lens, it gives a unique perspective on that. Um, yeah, so that does make sense of why you'd go from that angle in particular. Um, and is it that you talk to I think I remember you saying you talk to ace people on like forums and Reddit and such.
Yeah, so I have kind of a multifaceted strategy that I use in my research. One of them is something that I call like a cyber ethnography, which is going into like the Avon discussion forums or Reddit platforms that are subreddits that are
Yes,
frequented
yeah,
by
yeah.
asexual folks. So that's one thing that I do, kind of reading through these forums, looking at comments that have come up throughout the years. There's so much there. You can learn a lot from it. But also, I've spoken with a lot of asexual people just by interviewing them. Of course, this has been during COVID, so it's
Yeah.
mostly been a little bit via email, but also a ton of Zooming with ace folks. So it's a multifaceted approach.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess that way you can get like a broader perspective because not everyone would necessarily be willing to talk on a video call or something, but then you can get a bunch of different people's opinion if you go to a subreddit, for example.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, because I probably should have said this at some point, but the reason I knew about your research was from the ACE conference. You were part of the ACE research panel, um, and when I was watching that, one thing that interested me that you were saying about the proportion of uh, people who identify as men within the ACE community being significantly lower than what you'd see in other queer communities or just the general populace. And it is something that I have encountered quite often when I get called to do media interviews. It's because they can't find anyone who's male and identifies as asexual. And so Avon will be like, quickly, we need you again. Because I've cut, yeah, sometimes I'm just a token male
Mm.
ace. But I was wondering if you had any idea why, if you had any theories, any ideas about why that would be.
Sure. So I think what you're referring to is a study that I can't remember who did it, wasn't me, that finds that about, I think, 60% of ACE individuals identify as women, 30% as neither men nor women, and then only about 10% as men. And I agree that's a really shocking statistic.
Mm.
And it raises a lot of questions for why that would be the case. I guess I should start by saying there's so little research done on asexuality, especially compared to other sexual identities. So those numbers could be wrong. Maybe
Yeah,
we just
yeah.
haven't done enough research, and actually we'd find something really different with more data. However, I suspect that the numbers are not completely off and that there probably is some sort of gender divide happening within the community. What that is, I don't think anyone can say for sure. We need to do more research on it, but I do have some guesses for what it
Mm.
could be. I think one is that the types of gendered pressures that you face are really different for men and for women. So for traditional kind of normative masculinity, performing sexuality and especially performing heterosexuality is such a key way of proving that you're a man,
Mm.
basically.
Mm.
And so I think that similar pressure doesn't really exist for women in quite the same way, partially because in Western society, we take women's sexuality and sexual agency so much less seriously than we take men's. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, because I think there might be an inclination to say, wow, there are so many more ace women than ace men. It must be easier for women to identify as ace than for
Mm.
men. But I think that misses the fact that perhaps the reason for that is because we actually don't really care that much about whether women experience sexual
Yeah.
desire. More what we care about is that women are sexually available in heterosexual contexts to men. So I think it's some complicated stuff going on there.
Yeah, that lines up with what I was thinking as well, that society definitely expects and pressures men to be inherently more sexual than women. And in a lot of cases, the sexuality of women can be erased. I mean, earlier today, I saw an article that just on the sidebar of an internet that said women aren't having orgasms, and we need to fix that. And it's like, oh, that's not a problem for men at all, because, like, just men are expected to be so sexual, and especially, I think for gay men in particular, that is then dialed up. So you're almost expected to be hypersexual as a gay man, which makes it interesting when you're also ace.
Yeah, I think that point that you bring up about asexuality being erased is such an important one. I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. Like, what does asexual erasure look like? And is it the same for everyone within the ace community? And what I'm finding is basically that erasure, asexual erasure, is this very common experience in the ace community, as I'm sure will be surprising to very few people listening to this. But that looks really different depending on what your gender identity is. So women are greeted when they say, "Oh, I'm asexual," they're more likely to be greeted with something like, "Oh, well, how does that make you different from other women?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, like women don't really like sex anyway," where men are more likely to get a response like, well, that's impossible. All men want sex. And so in the end, asexuality is erased for both groups. But for men, it's because asexuality is seen as impossible. And for women, it's seen as unremarkable.
Yeah, and it's almost when a man says they're asexual, it's saying something. It's perceived to be saying something negative about themselves, and something that can't be possible. The man isn't thinking of sex all the time. Whereas if a woman, I can grammar. If a woman says it, then the person saying, "Oh, it's normal. Everyone's like that. Women shouldn't have any form of active sexuality," is more saying something negative about society. And yeah, it's interesting that the ace erasure can take those different forms based on your gender. And I guess speaking more about gender, one statistic that stood out for me was not just that there are a 10% versus 60% for men and women identifying as asexual in the study, however statistically significant that is. But that there were 30% of non-binary people, which is, well, 3 times the amount of people who identify as men in this study, whereas normally it would be closer to roughly 50-50 men and women, and then what's left over is non-binary people.
Yeah, that stood out to me as well. I think there are probably a few things going on there. I think one, maybe that people who are non-binary are more likely to become aware of and to embrace asexuality. I think when you're already existing outside of the cis-normative, heteronormative system that we live in, it's less pressure to kind of add on additional things that mark you as being outside of those binaries. So I think that's probably one reason. If you're already existing in that way, it's easier to adopt an asexual identity and to even learn about it in the first place. But something that I've also come across in my interviews with asexual people is that it appears that some people are actually coming to kind of question their gender identity after they learn about asexuality. And so after they learn about asexuality, decide that they're ace, they start to explore gender as well. And I think that's very fascinating. I'm not sure exactly what's going on there, but my guess is that asexuality is different from especially homosexuality and heterosexuality, where you kind of have to make an inherent assumption about even your own gender identity in order to occupy those sexual identities. You know, what does it mean to be attracted to the opposite sex or the same sex unless you are saying something about your own sex? But asexuality doesn't have that same assumption. And so it allows a little bit more room, I think, for gender exploration than some of our other sexual identity labels do. So I'm really interested to learn more about that, though. I'd love to hear what other people think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think particularly for in gay culture, there is, I think, there's still a very like heavy aspect of gender to it, whether that be, hey, we're 2 men, for example, or even just people who are more gay men who are more feminine or more masculine, and people having preferences for that either way. So I guess when you're outside of that, when you identify as asexual and you're outside of gender entirely because you don't feel sexual attraction towards anyone, then it's maybe easier to be non-binary and accept that part of yourself.
Yeah, and I think that starts to raise questions about like what exactly gender is. Because if that's true, that suggests that a huge amount of gender is about sexuality, actually. Right? Like we think of these concepts as being very separate from one another, but it's really hard to talk about one without talking about the other. And I think asexual perspectives make that even clearer.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, like you said, they're very intertwined. Literally, the definition of heterosexuality is being attracted to the opposite gender. So you're automatically talking about that. Whereas with asexuality, it doesn't have a direction, essentially. So you could be any gender, male, female, non-binary, and it wouldn't affect how that asexuality plays out. Whereas if you're a straight woman and a straight man, that's a very different experience. So yeah, maybe it does decouple the link between gender and sexuality by not having that target for the sexual attraction. And it is interesting because I identify as homoromantic asexual, and I guess when I've tried to think about my gender more as I've been a more part of the queer community, but I've kind of come onto the conclusion that I'm perfectly comfortable as a cis man, and I wonder whether it's more common for um, alloromantic aces, aces who feel romantic attraction to to a specific gender, maybe they are more likely to then either then not be non-binary, then still be part of that thing. Obviously, there's there's absolutely not going to be any studies that will tell us anything about that. But it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something. I think, like, even within the asexual community, there's so many axes that we could look at. There's so much diversity within the community that would shape very different experiences. And what you just said makes me think about something else that I found in my research that I think you'll find interesting, which is that a large number, actually, let me back up. When I was first starting this interview project, I was figuring I would group people into 3 categories: ace men, ace women, and then beyond the binary, asexuals. And then as I began interviewing people, I found that I was speaking with people who didn't really fit in any of those 3 categories, which I wasn't prepared for. And so what I've kind of discovered as I've spoken with more people and tried to figure this out is that there's at least among the ace people who I've spoken with, a significant number of them, disproportionately people who are assigned female at birth, who basically don't like to be understood through gendered terms whatsoever. So they're like, yeah, I'm not trans, I'm not exactly non-binary, I don't feel like I have an inherent gender identity, and I don't want to be understood through the lens of gender. And so I wonder if there's something about asexuality that even makes like that kind of critique of gender in a way more powerful or easier to come across.
Yeah, because I know that there's I don't know if agender was kind of fits what you were talking about, but the asexual, aromantic, agender communities are quite interlinked, and I wonder whether there's a reason for that.
Yeah,
like we were saying earlier.
Yeah, and also, like, I should say, I actually think what I'm finding is a little bit different from an agender identity, because an agender identity is still in some ways a gender identity, right? Yeah. It's a non-gender gender identity in a way. Where the people who I'm speaking about specifically aren't even adopting an agender identity. They're saying, like, no, I really don't want to be understood through any lens of gender, including agender.
Okay, yeah. That's interesting.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, yeah. It's not something that I've ever heard about, but yeah, if that works for them, that works for them. Cool. I guess to round off, obviously, we're talking a lot about how society's expectations of you because of your gender might affect the way you identify and whether you feel more or less pressured to be sexual and whether it's more or less pressure to come out as asexual. And I wonder, obviously, this is a little bit outside the scope of the research you've done, whether there would be any other intersectional identities that could, in a similar way, reduce or increase the proportion of people self-reporting as ace.
Yeah, I think that's such an important, smart question. I think we could probably talk all day about various identities that help to shape what your experience of asexuality is. I mean, we've already spoken about some, right? Gender, romantic attraction, etc. One that stands out to me as being particularly important for the asexual community to discuss is race. Race is such an important building block of modern society, and it really shapes your life experiences in so many ways. And so, of course, that would shape our experience of sexuality as well. And I have done a little bit of research on the intersection of race and asexuality, although it's not my primary focus.
Yeah.
So what I found is on the AVEN discussion boards and on these subreddits that are asexuality focused, that first of all, race doesn't come up as a topic of discussion much. But when it does, it's usually raised by someone who self-identifies as a person of color and not 100% of the time, but very frequently, they receive responses that are negative to what they're saying. So a person of color who's ace will say, oh, like I really want to talk about the way that race is relevant within our community. And they receive a lot of pushback from people. And of course, that's a problem, right? Because it reinforces kind of a feeling of unwelcoming to people of color within the asexual community. And also, I think another problem is that historically groups like AVEN, despite doing really amazing, important work for the asexual community, have also taken race-neutral stances. And I totally understand the inclination to do that. I think it's an effort to be welcoming and inclusive. But the result often of spaces that are race neutral is actually just that they're implicitly white and white dominated.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one thing that I notice when I'm in these spaces, kind of as an outsider in some ways. What I also notice in my interviews with asexual people is, again, asexual people of color really want to talk about the way that race influences their experience of asexuality, how perhaps asexuality is something that's less accessible to you when you're a person of color and your experience of it is different. But then when I speak to white asexual people, the response that I most commonly get is something, when I ask them, oh, do you think we should be talking about race when we're talking about asexuality, is yes, but it's not my place to talk about that. And again, I totally understand the inclination here. Race is a really touchy, complicated topic, but I think this is something that everyone in the community needs to put effort into learning about, right? And especially white people, in order to make the community more accessible to others. So I do know of some scholars who are doing great work on this who I can recommend.
Feel free to recommend them.
Okay, so Ayanna Hawkins Owen is a professor of English at Boston University. She does amazing work on the intersection, really specifically of Blackness and asexuality. Her work is fantastic, can't recommend it enough. Brittany Miles is a sociology PhD student at the University of Cincinnati who does similar work also on Blackness and asexuality. It's fantastic. And then also I recently met someone who's an incoming PhD student at Syracuse University. His name is Atiya McGee, who is doing, again, work specifically on Blackness and asexuality, but I believe also pulling in fatness studies too. So I'm really excited to see that work.
Yeah, and if you could send me those, send me a message with those in as well. I'll pop them in the names in the description, because I will undoubtedly misspell something if I try and do it from the way it sounds. But yeah, and I'd recommend as well, if anyone is interested in hearing the perspective of people of color, at the AVEN conference there was a Black Aces panel, which you can find on YouTube, but I'll put a link. And the year before, I believe there was an ACEs and ethnicity panel. But yeah, like you were saying, it's definitely important for white people as well to get involved with the conversation, because it's not fair to put all the onus on people of color to fix the issues of race, especially when, like you were saying, if they try to bring it up, they just get shot down, because that's not a very welcoming or constructive environment to fix and talk about these issues.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that'll take time. It'll be clumsy, but I think it's important work for the community to engage in.
Cool. Well, I think that's all I had written down to talk about today, unless there's anything else you want to bring up while you're here.
Nothing comes to mind for me.
We did, yeah, we've been talking for like nearly half an hour, so but yeah, it was very nice to talk to you, and your research is very interesting, so I hope it goes well.
Oh, thank you. And it was great to meet you. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Is there anything else you wanted to plug for the audience?
I guess the only thing I can think of is if people are interested in joining me on Twitter, you can find me It's just my name, Canton Weiner. I really enjoy interacting with people on Twitter because I learned so much from folks there. So please feel free to follow me there.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks again for coming on, and I will stop recording. I never know.